Okay, in this session, we're going to go through an example that will help us to be able to see, I think, a little bit better how this concept of leveraging, which involves borrowing or shorting, works. So I'm going to bring up the whiteboard for this so that we can be able to see the example. And we're going to start out with a fairly simple situation. We're going to say that we've got a risky asset. Now, a single risky asset works like this. We don't know what the return is going to be on this risky asset. Okay, it's a normal distribution, meaning that the return could be really high up here, or the return could be really low. We don't know what it's going to be. We'll find out later what it actually is. But the mean return or the average return is just right there in the middle, or we can say that is the expected return. So we're going to say that the expected return on this investment is 10%. Okay, could be higher than 10%, could be lower than 10%. Now, you can't get lower than negative 100% because you can't do worse than losing all your money. But at any rate, we could certainly get higher than 10% or lower than 10%. But 10% is kind of the middle of that probability distribution. So that's going to be our expected return. So we'll say the expected return on this investment is equal to 10%. Okay. Now let's suppose that we have $100 and we invest the $100 into this risky asset. And let's suppose everything goes as expected. It gets exactly a 10% rate of return. Then our $100 at the end, say this is for a year, our $100 turns into $110. Okay. So we invested $100 into our risky asset, got a 10% rate of return. We got $110. Now let's suppose we go and we want to borrow some money. Okay, let's suppose we we go to the bank and we can borrow some money at the bank at a interest rate of 6%. So we borrow $100 from the bank. So we've got our $100 plus the $100 we borrowed from the bank. We now have $200. We invest the $200 into this risky asset. So the $200 gets invested into the risky asset. And again, everything goes as expected. The investment gets a rate of return of 10%. So the $200 will turn into $220 there. Let me get rid of this thing here. Okay, turns into $220. Okay. Now, what do I have to do? I have to pay back the money that I borrowed from the bank plus interest. So remember, I borrowed $100 at 6% interest. So I have to subtract $106 that I used to pay back the bank. And that leaves me with $114. Now, remember, I started out with my money of $100. And here I turned it into $114. If I didn't borrow, my $100 turns into $110. But when I leverage, my $100 turns into $114. Okay. Man, leveraging looks like a wonderful thing. In fact, the more I leverage, the higher my return will be. And that is true if everything goes as expected. But things don't always go as expected. Let's suppose, again, I have $100 of my money and I invested into this risky asset. But this time, let's suppose things don't go quite as expected. And remember, we could have gotten a return higher than 10% or lower than 10%. Let's suppose the return is down here somewhere. It's a 2% rate of return is what we get, okay, which it certainly could be, okay? So if I get a 2% rate of return on my $100 turns into $102 at the end of the year, okay? Not what I was hoping for, but hey, I made something, didn't I? Now, again, let's suppose I go to the bank and I borrow $100 at an interest rate of 6%. And I now have $200 to invest in this risky asset. My $100 plus the $100 I borrowed from the bank. So just like before, I've got $200 that is being invested into the risky asset. And now, again, let's suppose that the investment gets a 2% rate of return. Not as well as I was expecting, but it's still got some sort of a positive return. So the $200 turns into $204, okay? And again, I have to pay back the money to the bank. I have to pay back the $100 I borrowed plus 6% interest. So I have to pay back $106. So from my $204, that leaves me with $98. So my $100 with leveraging turns into $98. Now, I'm not so glad that I leveraged. If I had not leveraged, my 100 would have turned into 102. But because I leveraged, my 100 turns into 98. So leveraging, we're not going to say that it's always good or that it's always bad. What we can say is this: if things go well, they will go better when you leverage. If things go badly, they will go worse when you leverage. Leveraging will increase your gains. Leveraging will also increase your losses. So in other words, leveraging will increase your expected return, but it will also increase your risk or your standard deviation. Okay, so let's take a look at it in mean variance space, which we kind of already have. Here is my expected return on the y-axis. Here's my standard deviation on the x-axis. Here's my risky asset. This was a risky asset here with an expected return of 10%, okay? And we don't need to worry about specifically what the standard deviation was. Now, in this case, the risk-free asset is the bank, okay? The bank is willing to lend me money at 6%. So we're going to put our risk-free right down here at 6%, okay? And if we draw our capital allocation line up here like this, okay, what we're doing, the first time through, I put all my money into the risky asset. Didn't put anything, didn't invest anything at the bank, and didn't borrow any money either, okay? So I had an expected return equal to the expected return of that risky asset of 10%. Now, when I went and leveraged money, that moved me up on the capital allocation line further, which increased my expected return and also increased my standard deviation, okay? So that if things went well, they went even better. But if things went badly, they went even worse. And that's what leveraging does, okay? Leveraging is something that will increase your expected return and will also increase your standard deviation. Now, what about our formula for the expected return of an asset? How does leveraging work in with that? Well, remember we said that the expected return on a portfolio is equal to the weight in asset 1 times the expected return of asset 1 plus the weight on asset 2 times the expected return on asset 2. Whether or not the asset 2 is risk-free or not doesn't make any difference in this case. So how do we deal with leveraging in this in light of this? Well, asset 1 was this risky investment right here. Pretty easy to see that that had a 10% rate of return. So the expected return on asset 1 was 10% there, right? Now, asset number 2 is the bank. And when I borrowed money from the bank, the return was at 6%. So my expected return, or you could call it the risk-free rate if you want to, that's fine, is going to be 6%, okay? So now here's the key. When I put all my money into asset number 1 and I borrowed $100 from the bank, that was a weighting of 2 onto the risky asset. My $100 is what I put in, my $100 plus the $100 I borrowed. In other words, I was able to invest twice as much as what I had. Okay, all I had was $100, but I invested $200 into the risky asset. So the weight on the risky asset was 2. Okay, so the weight on asset 1, the risky asset, is 2. Now, what's the weight on asset number 2? Asset number 2, again, is dealing with the bank. Well, I didn't invest in the bank. The bank invested in me. Okay, I borrowed from the bank. Borrowing is the reverse or the negative of investing. So whenever we borrow money, it's a negative weight. So in this case, I borrowed an amount from the bank equal to what I had. So my weighting on asset number 2 was negative 100%, or negative 1. So my weight on the risky asset was 200%, because I put 200% of my money in there. I had $100, but I put $200 in. That's 200% of my money. My weight on the bank was negative because I borrowed. I didn't invest it in the bank. I didn't put money in the bank. I borrowed from the bank. I had $100. I borrowed an amount equal to that. So my weighting on the transaction in the bank was negative 100%, or negative 1. Now, you might remember that we said that whenever you have a weighted average, the weights have to add up to 1. They do. 2 and negative 1 equals 1. So we're in good shape there. That still works. Now look what my expected return is with the leverage here. My expected return is going to be 2 times 10 is 20%. Negative 1 times 6 is negative 6%. 20% minus 6% is going to be equal to, guess what? 14%. And what rate of return did I get when everything went as expected? I got a 14% rate of return. So the formula still works. My expected return on the portfolio was 14%. When everything went as expected, I got a 14% rate of return. We could calculate standard deviations as well. We don't need to bother to do that. But again, I want you to notice that whenever we have a weighting greater than 1 or greater than 100%, the only way we can do that is if we are borrowing or shorting, and again, those terms are synonymous for us right now, somewhere else. And that means we have to have a negative weight somewhere else. In this very simple example, okay, we had $100 and we put $200 into the risky asset. So the weight on the risky asset was 2, or 200%. I had $100. I borrowed $100 from the bank, so my weight on that transaction with the bank was negative 1. It's a negative weighting whenever you borrow or short something. So I put a weight of 2 on the 10% expected return of the risky asset. I put a weight of negative 1 on the return of the bank transaction, and that gives me an expected return of 14%. And indeed, when everything went as expected, I got a 14% return. So we can see that clearly increased my expected return, but we also saw that it increased my standard deviation, increased my risk, because when things did not go well, when I only got a 2% rate of return on my risky asset, if I had not leveraged, I would have gotten that 2% rate of return right here. But because I leveraged, I did worse than that. I got a negative 2% rate of return. So again, when things go well, they go better with leverage. But when things go poorly, they go worse with leverage. To give you a little bit more information on this, actually, as long as my risky asset gets a greater rate of return than what I'm borrowing at, which in this example was 6%, it's going to be worth my while to have borrowed. But if my risky asset does worse than the rate of return that I borrowed at, in other words, if it got less than 6%, which it did when it got to 2%, then I'm going to wish I hadn't borrowed. I'm going to be worse off for having borrowed. Okay, so my risky asset needs to cover my borrowing costs, in this example, 6%. And then anything above that, it's going to be worthwhile to have borrowed. But if it doesn't cover that, then I'm going to be worse off for not having done it. So that's our fairly simple example. We're going to see a lot of instances, okay, where we have negative weights on assets. So it's important to understand that that's where you are leveraging. That's where you are borrowing or shorting. And we're going to see situations where you got more than 100% of your money into certain assets. You can only do that when you're borrowing somewhere else and putting that plus all of your money into risky assets. We're going to, in our next video together, we're going to see how this is really actually done when you're dealing with a broker and you are borrowing money to be able to buy some stocks.